I'm Stephanie and welcome back to Storytime with me. The story we're reading today is called Ruby the Red Fairy from the book The Rainbow Magic Treasury by Daisy Meadows. Ruby the Red Fairy. "Look, Dad," said Rachel Walker. She pointed across the blue-green sea at the rocky island ahead of them. "Is that Rainspell Island?" she asked. Her dad nodded. "Yes, our holiday is about to begin." The waves slapped against the side of the ferry, and Rachel felt her heart thump with excitement. Suddenly, a few fat raindrops popped down onto her head. "Oh," she gasped. Rachel's mom grabbed her hand. "Let's go inside," she said. "Isn't that strange?" Rachel said. "The sun is still shining. Let's hope the rain stops before we arrive," said Mr. Walker. Rachel looked out of the window. A girl was standing alone on the deck, staring up at the sky. Rachel slipped back outside to see what was so interesting. High above them was the most amazing rainbow that Rachel had ever seen. One end of the rainbow was far out to sea. The other seemed to fall somewhere on Rainspell Island. "Isn't it perfect?" the dark-haired girl whispered to Rachel. "Yes, it is," Rachel agreed. "Are you going to Rainspell on holiday?" The girl nodded. "I'm Kirsty Tate," she said. Rachel smiled. "I'm Rachel Walker. We're staying at Mermaid Cottage," she added. "And we're at Dolphin Cottage," said Kirsty. "Do you think we might be near each other?" "I hope so," Rachel replied. She had a feeling she was going to like Kirsty. The ferry sailed into Rainspell's tiny harbor. Seagulls flew around them and fishing boats bobbed on the water. "There you are, Rachel," called Mrs. Walker. Rachel saw her mom and dad coming onto the deck. "Mom, Dad, this is Kirsty," she said. "She's staying at Dolphin Cottage." "That's right next door to ours," said Mr. Walker. "I remember seeing it on the map." Rachel and Kirsty looked at each other in delight. "I'd better go find my mom and dad," said Kirsty. She looked around. "Oh, here they are." Kirsty's mom and dad came over to say hello. Then the ferry docked and everyone began to leave the boat. Mermaid Cottage and Dolphin Cottage were right next to the beach. Rachel loved her bedroom in the attic. From the window, she could see the waves rolling onto the sand. A shout from outside made her look down. Kirsty was standing under the window, waving at her. "Let's go and explore the beach," she called. Rachel dashed outside. Seaweed lay in piles on the sand, and there were tiny pink and white shells dotted about. "I love it here already," Rachel shouted, happily above the noise of seagulls. "Me too," Kirsty said. She pointed up at the sky. "Look, the rainbow's still there." Sure enough, the rainbow glowed brightly among the fluffy white clouds. "Have you heard the story about the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow?" Kirsty asked. Rachel nodded. "Yes, but that's just in fairy stories," she said. Kirsty grinned. "Maybe. Let's go and find out for ourselves." "Okay," Rachel agreed. They rushed back to tell their parents they were going for a walk. Then they set off along the lane. It led away from the beach towards a small wood. Rachel kept looking up at the rainbow. She was worried that it would start to fade, now that the rain had stopped. But the colors stayed clear and bright. "It looks like the end of the rainbow is over there," Kirsty said. "Come on," and she hurried towards the trees. The wood was cool and green after the heat of the sun. Rachel and Kirsty followed a winding path until they came to a clearing. Then they both stopped and stared. The rainbow shone down onto the grass through a gap in the trees, and there at the rainbow's end lay an old black pot. "There really is a pot of gold," Kirsty exclaimed. "It could just be a cooking pot," Rachel said. "Some campers might have left it behind." But Kirsty shook her head. "I don't think so," she said. "It looks really old." The pot was sitting on the grass upside down. "Let's have a closer look," said Kirsty. She tried to turn it over. "It's heavy," she gasped. Rachel went to help her. They pushed and pushed at the pot. This time it moved, just a little. Let's try again, Kirsty panted. Are you ready, Rachel? Tap, tap, tap. What was that? Rachel gasped. I don't know, whispered Kirsty. Tap, tap. Kirsty looked down. I think it's coming from inside the pot. Rachel's eyes opened wide. Are you sure? She bent down and put her ear to the pot. Tap, tap. Then to her amazement, Rachel heard a tiny voice. Help, it called. Help me. Rachel grabbed Kirsty's arm. Did you hear that? Kirsty nodded. Quick, she said, we must turn the pot over. Rachel and Kirsty pushed at the pot as hard as they could. It began to rock from side to side. We're nearly there, Rachel panted. Suddenly, the pot rolled onto its side. A shower of sparkling red dust flew out of it. And there, right in the middle of the glittering cloud, was a tiny girl with wings. Rachel and Kirsty watched in wonder as the tiny girl fluttered in the sunlight, her delicate wings sparkling with all the colors of the rainbow. Oh, Rachel, Kirsty whispered, it's a fairy. The fairy fluttered just above Rachel and Kirsty. Her short, silky dress was the color of strawberries. Red earrings glowed in her ears. Her golden hair was plaited with tiny red roses, and she wore crimson slippers on her little feet. She waved her wand, and a shower of sparkling red fairy dust floated down to the ground. Where it landed, all sorts of red flowers appeared with a pop. Rachel and Kirsty watched open-mouthed. It really and truly was a fairy. This is like a dream, Rachel said. I always believed in fairies, said Kirsty, but I never thought I'd see one. The fairy flew towards them. Oh, thank you so much, she called in a tiny silvery voice. I'm free at last. She glided down and landed on Kirsty's hand. Kirsty gasped. The fairy felt lighter and softer than a butterfly. I was beginning to think I'd never get out of that pot, said the fairy. Tell me your names, quickly, there's so much to be done, and we must get started right away. Rachel wondered what the fairy meant. I'm Rachel, she said. And I'm Kirsty, said Kirsty. I'm the red rainbow fairy, but you can call me Ruby, the fairy replied. Ruby, Kirsty breathed, a rainbow fairy. Yes, said Ruby, I have 6 sisters, Amber, Saffron, Fern, Sky, Izzy, and Heather. One for each color of the rainbow, you see. It's our job to put all the different colors into Fairyland, she explained. Why were you shut up inside that old pot, said Rachel. And where are your sisters? Kirsty added. Ruby's wings drooped and her eyes filled with tears. I don't know, she said. Something terrible has happened in Fairyland. We need your help. Of course we'll help you, Kirsty said. Ruby wiped her eyes. Thank you, she said. First, I must show you something. Follow me as quickly as you can. She flew into the air, her wings shimmering in the sunshine. Rachel and Kirsty followed Ruby across the clearing. The fairy stopped by a pond under a willow tree. Look, she said, I can show you what happened yesterday. She flew over the pond and scattered another shower of sparkling fairy dust with her wand. The water lit up with a strange silver light. Rachel and Kirsty watched in astonishment as a picture appeared. It was like looking through a window into another land. A river of brightest blue ran past hills of greenest green. Scattered on the hillsides were red and white toadstool houses, and on top of the highest hill stood a silver palace with 4 pink towers. The towers were so high their points were almost hidden by the fluffy white clouds. Hundreds of fairies were making their way towards the palace. Rachel and Kirsty could see elves, pixies, and sprites too. Everyone seemed very excited. Yesterday was the day of the Fairyland Midsummer Balls, Ruby explained. She pointed with her wand. There I am, with my rainbow sisters. Kirsty and Rachel saw 7 fairies, each dressed prettily in their own rainbow color. The midsummer ball is very special, Ruby went on. My sisters and I are in charge of sending out invitations. To the sound of tinkling music, the front doors of the palace slowly opened. Here come King Oberon and Queen Titania, said Ruby, the fairy king and queen. Kirsty and Rachel watched as the king and queen stepped out. The king wore a splendid golden coat and golden crown. His queen wore a silver dress and a tiara that sparkled with diamonds. Everyone cheered. After a while, the king signaled for quiet. Fairies, elves, pixies, and sprites, he began. Welcome to the midsummer ball. The fairies clapped and cheered again. Suddenly, a gray mist filled the picture. Kirsty and Rachel watched in alarm as all the fairies started to shiver. A loud, chilly voice shouted out, "Stop the music!" A tall, bony figure was pushing his way through the crowd. He was dressed all in white, and there was frost on his white hair and beard. Icicles hung from his clothes, but his face was red and angry. Everyone looked scared. "Who's that?" Rachel asked with a shiver. "Jack Frost," said Ruby. Jack Frost glared at the 7 rainbow fairies. "Why wasn't I invited to the midsummer ball?" he asked coldly. The rainbow fairies gasped in horror. Ruby looked up from the pond picture. "Yes, we forgot to invite Jack Frost," she said. In the pond picture, the fairy queen stepped forward. "You are very welcome, Jack Frost," she said. "Please stay and enjoy the ball." But Jack Frost just looked angrier. "Too late," he hissed. "You forgot to invite me." He pointed a thin, icy finger at the rainbow fairies. "You will not forget this," he snarled. "My spell will banish the rainbow fairies to the 7 corners of the mortal world. From this day on, Fairyland will be without color forever." An icy wind began to blow. It picked up the 7 rainbow fairies and spun them up into the sky. The other fairies watched in dismay. Jack Frost turned to the king and queen. "Your rainbow fairies will never return," he cackled. He walked away, leaving a trail of icy footprints. The fairy queen lifted her silver wand. "I cannot undo Jack Frost's magic completely," she cried, "but I can guide the rainbow fairies to a safe place where they will be rescued." She pointed her wand at the sky. A black pot came spinning through the stormy clouds. One by one, the rainbow fairies tumbled into the pot. "Pot at the end of the rainbow. Keep our rainbow fairies safely together," the queen called, "and take them to Rainspell Island." The pot flew out of sight behind a dark cloud. At once, the bright colors of Fairyland began to fade until it looked like an old black and white photograph. "Oh no," Kirsty gasped. The picture in the pond vanished. "The fairy queen cast her own spell," Rachel said. "She put you and your sisters in the pot and sent you to Rainspell." Ruby nodded. Rainspell is a place full of magic. She knew would be safe here. "But where are your sisters?" asked Kirsty. "They were in the pot too." Ruby looked upset. "Jack Frost's spell was very strong," she said. "I was at the bottom, so I was safe, but I was trapped when the pot landed upside down." "So your sisters are somewhere on Rainspell?" Kirsty said. Ruby nodded. "They're scattered all over the island. Jack Frost's spell has trapped them too." She flew onto Kirsty's shoulder. "That's where you and Rachel come in." "How?" Rachel asked. "You found me, didn't you?" the fairy said. "So you could rescue my rainbow sisters too. Then we can all bring color back to Fairyland." "Of course we'll search for your sisters," Kirsty said. "Won't we, Rachel?" Rachel nodded. "Oh, thank you," Ruby said happily. "But we're only here for a week," Rachel said. We must get started right away, said Ruby. First, I must take you to Fairyland to meet the King and Queen. You're taking us to Fairyland? Kirsty gasped. But how will we get there? Rachel said. We'll fly there, Ruby replied. But we can't fly, Rachel pointed out. Ruby smiled. She whirled up into the air and swirled her wand above them. Magic red fairy dust fluttered down. Rachel and Kirsty began to feel a bit strange. Were the trees getting bigger or were they getting smaller? They were getting smaller. Smaller and smaller and smaller, until they were the same size as Ruby. I'm tiny, Rachel laughed. She was so small the flowers around her seemed like trees. Kirsty twisted round to look at her back. She had shiny, delicate wings. Ruby beamed. Let's go! Rachel twitched her shoulders. Her wings fluttered and she felt herself rise up into the air. She was quite wobbly at first. Help! Kirsty yelled as she shot up into the air. I'm not very good at this. Come on, said Ruby, taking their hands. I'll help you. She led them up out of the glade. Rachel looked down on Rainspell Island. She could see the cottages next to the beach and the harbor. Where is Fairyland, Ruby? Kirsty asked. It's so far away that no mortal could ever find it, Ruby said. They flew through the clouds for a long, long time. At last, Ruby turned to them and smiled. We're here, she said. As they flew down, Kirsty and Rachel saw places they recognized from the pond picture. The palace, the hillsides, the toadstool houses. But there were no bright colors now. Because of Jack Frost's spell, everything was a drab shade of gray. Even the air felt cold and damp. A few fairies walked miserably across the hillsides. Their wings hung limply down their backs. Suddenly, one of the fairies looked up. Look, she shouted, it's Ruby! At once, the fairies flew up to meet Ruby, Kirsty, and Rachel. Have you come from Rainspell, Ruby? Where are the other rainbow fairies? Who are your friends? Said another fairy. First, we must see the king and queen, said Ruby. Then I will tell you everything. King Oberon and Queen Titania were seated on their thrones. Their palace was as great as everywhere else in Fairyland, but they smiled warmly when Ruby arrived with Rachel and Kirsty. Welcome back, Ruby, said the queen. We have missed you. Your Majesties, these are my friends Kirsty and Rachel. They believe in magic, Ruby announced. She told everyone how Rachel and Kirsty had rescued her. Will you help us to find Ruby's rainbow sisters? The queen asked. Yes, we will, Kirsty said. How will we know where to look? Said Rachel, feeling worried. Don't worry, said the queen. The magic you need to find each rainbow fairy will find you. Just wait and see. King Oberon rubbed his beard. You have 6 days of your holiday left, and 6 fairies to find, he said. That's a lot of fairy finding. You will need some special help. He nodded at one of his footmen, a plump frog in a buttoned-up jacket. The frog hopped over to Rachel and Kirsty and handed them each a tiny silver bag. The bags contain magic tools, the queen told them. Open them only when you really need to, and you will find something to help you. Look, shouted another frog footman. Ruby is beginning to fade. Rachel and Kirsty looked at Ruby in horror. The fairy was growing paler. Her lovely dress was no longer red but pink, and her golden hair was turning white. Jack Frost's magic is still at work, said the king. We cannot undo his spell until all the rainbow fairies are together again. Quick, Ruby, urged the queen. You must return to Rainspell at once. Ruby, Kirsty, and Rachel flew into the air. Don't worry, Kirsty called. We'll be back with all the rainbow fairies very soon. Good luck, called the king and queen. As they flew further away from Fairyland, Ruby's colors began to return. Soon she was bright and sparkling again. When they reached Rainspell again, they landed in the clearing next to the old black pot. Ruby scattered fairy dust over Rachel and Kirsty. There was a puff of glittering red smoke, and the 2 girls shot up to their normal size. Rachel wriggled her shoulders. Her wings had gone. I loved being a fairy, Kirsty said. They watched as Ruby sprinkled her magic dust over the old black pot. What are you doing? Rachel asked. Jack Frost's magic means that I can't help you look for my sisters, Ruby explained. I will wait for you here, in the pot at the end of the rainbow. Suddenly the pot began to move. It rolled across the grass and stopped under the weeping willow tree. The pot will be hidden under the tree, said Ruby. I'll be safe there. We'd better start looking for the other rainbow fairies, Rachel said to Kirsty. Where shall we start? Ruby shook her head. Remember what the Queen said? She told them. The magic will come to you. She flew into the air. Goodbye and good luck. We'll be back soon, Ruby, said Kirsty, and we're going to find all your rainbow sisters, Rachel promised. Are you excited to help Kirsty and Rachel look for the other rainbow fairies? If you are, then keep an eye out for upcoming videos on the rainbow fairies. I'll see you in the next video.